questions. Going to make this show great. You can send them to pod@longtermwords.com. Keep them coming. That would be great. Before we get into that, I want to talk about something that has bothered me for a long time. I've written about it a little bit, spoken about it a little bit, but I hear it almost every time I go out and do a presentation somewhere else, speak to a group of people, and you do a Q&A. The single most question that I get, and have been getting for 20 years, same question, some variation of the question: how do you make decisions in today's world that is so uncertain? And it's always framed as like, it used to be certain in the past, but today we have this uncertainty. It's always like that we live in an abnormal, uncertain time. And look, I won't discount that there's a lot of volatility, craziness, insanity, bad behavior, poor decisions, all of that in the world. And as things, new technologies, AI, whatever it might be, there's plenty of things to look at today and say, look, given this craziness that we're dealing with and the uncertainty of the future, how do you make decisions? What I've always disagreed with, and I understand why it gets framed like this, but I've always disagreed with is the idea that what we're living through today is more uncertain than it was at various points in the past. At almost any point in the past. The past always seems more certain than it was to those living at the time because we know how that story ends. It's always like that. There's a great quote that I love, which is, everything feels unprecedented when you haven't engaged with history. If I've said that quote a million times on the podcast before, I'll say it a million times more because I think it's fantastic. And whenever people talk about how uncertain current times are, I always want to stop and say, when were times certain, or at least relatively more certain than they are today? When was there less uncertainty than there is today? And they'll point to periods in the past that I think you could easily, quickly stop and say, no. That was an unbelievably uncertain time. And so people will point to, let's say, the 1990s, particularly the late 1990s, when there was, relative to a lot of other times in history, a feeling at least of geopolitical stability, economic stability, cultural stability, at least relative to previous times. And they'll say, like, those were the good days. Those were the glory days. And part of me wants to say, okay, so we're talking about the late 1990s, as in, 24 months before 9/11, completely upended everything that we know in the modern world, economically, politically, culturally. That was the certainty. That was when we could see the future with a lot of foresight. Maybe 2006, 2007, when we had finally recovered from that post 9/11 stupor and fear. That was the certainty just before the financial crisis that you probably didn't see coming and completely upended everything about the world that you know. Maybe 2012, 2013, when we finally started getting over the financial crisis, just before, whether it was Brexit or the political climate in the United States turn for whatever it is that we're in right now. Maybe you feel that the world was calm and certain in 2018, 2019, just before COVID came out of the middle of nowhere and upended every single aspect of your life. Whenever you look back at those periods with a sense of those were the good old days, it inevitably, like, the irony is what you think was certainty, as if the period that you thought you could see the future with the most amount of clarity is actually, in hindsight, the period just before things were about to fall off the cliff. It's a period that in hindsight was the most uncertain. That's always the irony of it. A big part of this too, there's this great Russian quote that I love, which is talking about nostalgia. And it says, the past is more uncertain than the future, which is like how we remember the past is so up for interpretation. And we misremember what things actually felt like and were going on. And so when you know how the story ends in hindsight, you look back at the past and you think those were the good days because you can't remember how much you worried about the future, a future that you didn't know how it was going to pan out. But we do know how it panned out when we're looking back in hindsight. And so at any given moment, it always feels like the present is more uncertain than the past. When I think the truth is, without minimizing anything that's going on today, I don't think the world today is more uncertain than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I was reading a book recently called The Fourth Turning. It's a pretty famous book. A lot of you have probably read it. Mixed feelings about it, but it was an interesting book nonetheless. But that book, written in the 1990s, was talking about, as kind of a passing point, this wasn't the main thrust of the book, but was talking about how at the present time that they were writing it in the 90s, the mood of the country was so bad. And people were negative and they were pessimistic and then the political climate was not great relative to what it had been. And that was written in the 1990s. And then you fast forward today, and we're like, those were the good old days. And when it was book that was written in the 1990s, it was talking about how everyone in the 90s was yearning for the good old days in the 80s. And in the 80s, you go back to then, and they were yearning for the good old days of the 60s. Nobody yearned for the 70s. The 70s were terrible. But I think that's generally how it works. It's always, once you know how the story ends, the past looks so great, and the present that you're living in feels so fearful. And that actually, I think, is actually pretty optimistic, that it's painful to wake up and think that you are now living in the age of uncertainty, when the reality is everyone always has, always. Everyone at every point in time is staring down a future that could go in many different directions, big risks that nobody sees coming. That's true today. It's absolutely true today. And it's always been true. All right, one last thing before I get into your questions. Just a quick little snippet, kind of out of the middle of nowhere here. I wrote about an MIT scientist in the Psychology of Money named Robert Weinberg. And Robert Weinberg is a molecular biologist who studies cancer, which is something that I know absolutely nothing about. But what I've loved about Robert Weinberg is that he's very well-spoken. He can just explain things in a way that if you're not a PhD molecular biologist, you can understand. And so he's been in several documentaries, and he's done several interviews that I've always thought him just a really smart and articulate guy. And he did an interview many years ago, and I was watching it on YouTube recently. I'd read about this before, I was watching it, and I just thought he just made such an astute, articulate point. And the point was about the fact that he has worked at MIT for 50 years. He did his undergraduate degree there, and he's still working there 50 years later. And about how much benefit that gave to his career, that he had been in one spot, in one office for half a century. I just want to play this little snippet for you. Here's what he said.
People say to me sometimes, how could you stay at one place for so long? We all know the lives of academic gypsies who spend 3 years here, 14 years there, 5 years there. And each time, each place they settle down, they make friends, social friends, colleagues. And then after a period of time, they and their families are uprooted and moved to some other place. And there's never any constancy in their lives, never any robust social network, never any lifelong friends whom one can associate with. And so I have no regret having been a stick in the mud, having never really moved very far, and working now only a couple hundred yards from where I was an undergraduate in the dorm at MIT.
I think that applies to so many aspects of life, no matter what you do or where you work or what you're doing. The value of sticking with something through thick and thin, and letting the benefits of social compounding accrue to you. Maybe that's the important point. People know financial compounding. They know like earning interest on interest. They know how that money compounds over time. It's harder to contextualize social compounding, of the value of friendships and trust, the value of understanding how an organization works, understanding people's different personalities, compounding memories that become your most valuable asset over time. Look, this is not to say you should always stick with every relationship and job and whatever it might be, even if it's not obviously not working out. That's not the point. But it's easy to discount the value of sticking with something for a very long period of time. My wife sent me this Instagram video this past week. It went viral. I'm sure some of you have seen it. It's this older gentleman who is packing up from his house. His house is completely empty, like he's just moved out. And he's in this empty living room. And he calls out the name of his children who are not there. So he's sitting in this empty living room and he goes, Jack, Caroline, and it's like echoing throughout this empty house. And you realize that this is his last moment in this house that he's lived in for a very long time. And then he walks out and he locks the door, and that's the end of the existence in the house. It's a very powerful video of just, you think about the memories that took place in there and whatnot. And I always think about that, as Charlie Munger says, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And memories compound, relationships compound. The value of sticking with something for a very long time, whether it's a relationship or a career or a job, whatever it might be, is profound. So thank you, Robert Weinberg. All right, let me get into your questions.